next, I think we'd like to bring the spaceships closer to Earth, but not quite all the way, and hear from Shirlee Smith Matheson, who is a YA writer, historian, avionics. I think you name it, she's almost done it. She can tell us what she hasn't done.
All right. Finding where you fit in as a writer is always a challenge, and you can change that path many different times. When I started writing, I was about grade 5, 6, and I didn't know what to write. I had never read any books about where I lived. And in those days, the books were either set in big cities or in another country, America or England. And they'd talk about garden walls and stuff, and I hadn't a clue. We lived on a farm, what's a garden wall? But one day, I was in the 6th grade in Lacombe, Alberta, just near Red Deer here, and I saw this book in our library, The Wild Dog of Edmonton. I got this off Amazon because I thought this, it still exists. And I took it out. I love dog stories, animal stories, and I read it. And it's a good story. A dog, gets lost from his owners and is under the 9th Street Bridge, and he has to chase rabbits and kill them to eat and, run away from coyotes. We say coyotes, by the way, not coyotes. Anyway, so... So I read the book, and I thought, you can write about here, because this was Edmonton. This was only 80 miles up the road. I knew that city, I knew that bridge, I knew that river. And so that was very exciting discovery. And I thought, okay, I will write then about here. What am I reading? This is another good clue. What are you reading? Because you can't write what you can't read. And so I was reading mysteries. I thought, well, Trixie Belden and Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and all those ones. And I thought, well, then I shall write a mystery. But first I had to find one. And that's when I started to spy on my neighbors. And I still do.
You're not supposed to know about that.
Well, yes, because one has to get information. And I thought, well, then we had, I was going to be a writer. I couldn't have a boring name like Shirlee Smith, which that was my name. It still is, basically. So I invented a new name, and I sent away for ID. I'm 12 years old. I sent away for false ID. And my new name was Liberty Sador. So that was the beginning. Well, I continued to write and moved different places, moved to the Okanagan, to Vernon, and joined a writer's group, which is the first time I ever had done so, and I was just totally intimidated. I walked into, we held the meetings in people's homes, and about 20 people were there, and some had even been published. It was really a frightening thing. Well, as I progressed, I started winning prizes for short stories. And then when we moved up north to Hudson's Hope, this was my group. These were my friends. So I would continue, like they had a Christmas story contest every year, judged anonymously, and I would win. And finally, living, 800 miles away and winning every year got them a little bit peeved with me. And I didn't realize it until finally they said, "You've won again, go get your own damn plaque." So I had to go to Dawson Creek 100 miles to get my own damn plaque. So at that point, I decided I needed to upgrade my friends. And yes. So the only writer in Hudson's Hope that I knew was a trapper. And he had a master's degree in Chicago University, and he was head of the BC Trappers Association. So I said, "Would you critique my stories?" And he said, "Have you ever had a formal critique?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Can you take it?" And I said, "You bet." So he came back and he says, "Why are you writing all these Christmas stories?" I says, "Because they're winning." And he said, "Stop it right now." And he said, "You can write. Now you've got to find the next step. So I applied at the Banff School of Fine Arts, which is fantastic. It was headed at that time by W.O. Mitchell, one of our absolutely wonderful, he's passed away now, authors. And just the people that were there, Irving Layton, Robert Croach, Richard Lem, Phyllis Webb, we had the very, very best instructors. And you know, so what we had to do was write free fall, as they call it, which is stream of consciousness writing. They didn't want a poem, they didn't want a story, they didn't want a beginning and end, they wanted you to sit there and let it all out. Well, you know, when you're over 15, you just don't do that anymore. And so I started to write and kind of neat and tidy. And finally he said, go back in your memories. And I said, okay, fine. I began my schooling, grade 1, in a one-room Ukrainian country school in rural Manitoba. I was the only non-Ukrainian named Smith. So he said, okay, let's hear more about it. All right. So I pretended I was going back and going through Manitoba. And I said, I'm surrounded by ghosts. As I drive down the narrow dirt road, speckled with yellow and brown fallen leaves, the phantoms swirl about me, bringing to mind fragments of forgotten lore. You know, he said, deeper, deeper, go deeper. I said, you're kidding. He said, deeper. So here's what came. My brother made his spending monies by selling gopher tails. He bought his bicycle from Gopher Tails. Sometimes I would accompany him to check the traps. We would carry the dead gophers back home to the chopping block if he'd forgotten his knife. One day I went out by myself. In the farthest corner of the field, I spotted his newest trap, glinting silver in the sun. It had been sprung and now lay useless. I would reset it. He would be so proud of me. Kneeling down, I grabbed the strong steel jaws with my small 5-year-old hands. Snap! The trap sprung to life, slapping my 2 hands back to back in its jaws. I pulled at the trap, but I couldn't get the chain off the stake that held it, pounded deep into the ground. I yanked uselessly, sobbing. My hands were blue and bulging, bleeding where the teeth bit into my skin. I sat down beside the gopher hole. Was something moving down there? Was I to be trapped here forever? Would the gophers run over me in the night if no one came to get me? I sobbed aloud. Then, losing all control, I wailed in tears until tears flooded my throat. The wind pushed my cries back, dried my tears, reprimanded me for breaking the prairie's silence. The dog ran around, nervous, whining. Then, with one guilty back glance, he slunk away over the rise, belly to the ground, tail between his retreating legs. I lay down on the prickly stubble, burrowed into the warm earth, and eventually fell asleep. I dreamed I saw a waving, endless field, and somewhere in the middle, 2 black, moving specks. Closer and closer they came, their shapes wavering in the horizon. The gophers were silenced, the prairie quiet, as if becoming dormant until the advancing forms could be recognized. The forms took shape, my dog, and behind him, my mother, running. So I wrote that, and I handed it in, and W.O. came and leaned against my office door, and he said, someday you will be a fine Canadian writer. And I wouldn't have said that when you first got here. So that's the way we start. Now, I had written some stories about a very wicked town that we lived in, just near Calgary. There were 3 incidents involving guns on our street that one winter. Someone went to the local cabaret with a container of sulfuric acid. You know, it was a really interesting town. And when something is either really bad or really good, a writer's got some meat, right? Something, I shouldn't say that, I'm a vegetarian. So I started to write about the town from a mother, like fictionalizing, but from the mother's point of view, and I sent it out as a short story. And a man named David Christensen, some of you may know him, worked for a literary magazine, Grain, and he sent it back and he said, there's some good writing here, but gee, that protagonist, that mother sounds whiny. And I thought, gee, that was me. He said, what would the 12-year-old daughter have felt? Oh, wow. So I wrote the book, or the story, which became, and he said, you've got too much material here. Oh, for a short story? Well, I'll make a book. So it became my first published young adult novel. And as I say, this is how you flow into things. You don't know, but somebody gives you a little bit of a hint, a little bit of an idea, and you go to town. That story, Valley Girl, was in this anthology, Country Roads, the Gopher story. And then when I moved up north, you know, when you move to a small place and everybody asks you to write, because you're a writer, I wrote poems for people's birthday parties, you know, you name it, anything. Somebody gave me a crocheted cushion for writing a poem. Good, I can't crochet, she can't write a poem, neither can I, but she didn't mind. But one day, a man was at my door, and I knew he was a very bad man, because it was a small town, we know the bad men. And he's standing there, and I said, what do you want? He said, I want you to write a letter for me. I said, okay, I can do that. And I thought, my gosh, is he going to apply for a job? The world's turning. And I said, I can do that, because I wrote people's resumes and such. And he says, I want you to write a letter explaining why I killed my brother. And I said, have you done it yet? And he said, no, I'm going to as soon as you finish the letter. And I said, well, what's the point here? And he said, well, you'll write a good letter, I know you can write, and it'll explain to the RCMP why I had to kill my brother because he's a jerk. And for the first and only time in my life, I said, I don't think I'm that good of a writer. So I said to him, I knew he was a little off, you know, and I said, why don't you go over to the RCMP station and tell them your plan and ask them if it'll work, if it'll hold up in court. He said, okay. So I shut the door and phoned his brother, and I said, get out of town. He said, is he at that again? You know, and so this is the way we go along. And at that same time, I got a call from a Catholic nun named Sister Gemma, and she said, we've been talking about Father Youngblood, a wonderful man, interesting man. You should write a book about him. I said, I don't know him. She said, so meet him. I said, he's a Catholic priest. I'm not Catholic. She says, we know, you know, small town. Then she said the magic words, and something that all of you should think about. You're a writer, aren't you? Writers can write about anybody or anything. Do your research, do it. Young Blood of the Peace was my first book. I wrote a play from it. It was at the Fringe Festival in Edmonton. And then, of course, being in the north, surrounded by bush pilots, I started writing aviation stories. And this was my first one, and 8 books later, there's no end, as Michael knows, of stories about aviation and space. So this is what I'd like you to think about. You don't know where you're at now. Someone will say something, an opportunity will come, something gets thrown in your path, and suddenly that is your path, and you've got it. And don't accept the imposter syndrome, that black dog that's on your back that says, who do you think you are, that you can do this? Because you can. That's it.